The date is July 3rd, 1916. New York City is paralyzed by a stagnant heat wave, with humidity levels exceeding 85% and temperatures peaking at 92 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1032 Fifth Avenue, the residence of Annie Leary, a papal countess and socialite, the air is heavy with the smell of floor wax and expensive perfume. In the kitchen, an 81-year-old woman stands in violent contrast to the Gilded Age opulence surrounding her. She is Henrietta Howland Robinson Greene, known to the press as the Witch of Wall Street, but today she is merely a woman consumed by a 4-cent discrepancy. Her dress is a relic of the previous century, made of black bombazine, a heavy twill-weave fabric of silk and wool, so worn that the friction of her movements has turned the elbows into translucent membranes. It has been remended with iron safety pins and lined with old newspapers for insulation, a garment valued at perhaps $5 in 1916 or $148 in 2026 currency. The confrontation is technical and aggressive. Greene is arguing with a domestic servant over the price of a pint of skimmed milk. In 1916, the average price for a quart of whole milk was 9 cents. Skimmed milk, often relegated to the poor, cost 5. To Greene, the 4-cent difference represents a percentage loss that her internal ledger cannot tolerate. While she screams, the mechanical sounds of the era punctuate the tension. The rhythmic whirring of a General Electric 6-blade oscillating fan, a luxury item of the period, and the distant clatter of iron-shod hooves on cobblestone. Greene's face, etched with the geometric lines of extreme age and chronic parsimony, contorts. Her eyes, which had spent decades calculating the fluctuations of the New York Stock Exchange, lose focus. The biological failure is instantaneous. A massive stroke, then termed apoplexy, severs the connection between her mind and her empire. As she collapses onto the marble floor, the contents of her reticule spill. There are no jewels, no keys to mansions, no letters of credit. There is a small tin of dry oatmeal and a handful of loose change. 1 nickel, worth approximately $1.48 today, rolls across the stone. At this moment, her net worth is estimated at $100 million. In 2026 purchasing power, this is a liquidity of $2,095 billion. She is the wealthiest woman in the world, yet she expires on a floor that does not belong to her, wearing rags that a common laborer would discard. The context of 1916 New York is one of extreme transition. The Federal Revenue Act of 1916 had just been passed, doubling the top income tax rate from 7 to 15% to fund the preparedness movement for World War I. Greene's death occurs in a year where the average annual wage is $708, $20,800 today, and a loaf of bread costs 7 cents. Her existence was a mathematical anomaly that the era could no longer sustain. As her pulse vanishes, the financial world waits. The movement of $2, $95 billion in capital, mostly held in liquid bonds, real estate, and predatory loans, threatens to destabilize the very market she manipulated for half a century. The witch is dead, but the ghost of her greed has already begun to haunt her children. The fall of 1916 was merely the final act of a woman who, to protect billions, had already condemned her own flesh to rot. The origin of this obsession is rooted in the granite and salt of New Bedford, Massachusetts, 1834. At the time, New Bedford was the wealthiest city per capita in the United States, fueled entirely by the brutal logistics of the whaling industry. Henrietta was born into the Robinson and Howland families, a Quaker dynasty that viewed wealth not as a means of comfort, but as a divine stewardship of cold, hard capital. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, was a man of iron and vinegar who owned a quarter interest in the largest whaling fleet in the world. The technical reality of this wealth was visceral, the rendering of whale blubber into spermaceti oil, a substance used for high-end candles and industrial lubrication. A single whaling voyage could last 4 years and return a profit of $30,000, equivalent to $1.1 million in 2026. By age 6, while her peers were instructed in the social graces of the Victorian era, Henrietta was sequestered in her grandfather Gideon Howland's study. His eyesight was failing, likely due to untreated glaucoma, and he required the girl to read him the daily financial reports. She did not read fairy tales. She read the shipping list and the price current. She learned to analyze the cost of hemp for ropes, the price of salt pork for cruise, and the fluctuating value of whale oil per barrel. The education was reinforced by the Quaker Society of Friends discipline. Plainness in dress and speech was mandatory. Any expenditure that did not result in a return was considered a moral failing. The girl was taught that a dollar not invested was a dollar stolen from the future. The macro context of 1837 shaped her formative years. The Panic of 1837 was the first Great American Depression, caused by a speculative bubble in land and the failure of wheat crops. It lasted until the mid-1840s. While other families faced ruin, the Robinsons thrived by hoarding specie, gold and silver, and buying devalued assets for pennies. This taught Henrietta a lesson she would carry to her grave. Cash is the only true weapon in a collapsing market. In 1840, the cost of a basic education for a girl was negligible, but her father invested in her mathematical literacy. She was sent to a finishing school in Lowell, but she focused on accounting rather than etiquette. When her father gave her $200, $45,000 today, for a wardrobe to attract a suitor in New York, she bought a few cheap dresses and invested the remaining $1,000 in government bonds. In 1865, the death of her father brought the apprenticeship to a conclusion. Edward Mott Robinson left a fortune of $5.9 million. In 2026 terms, this inheritance was worth $118 million. It was a sum that could have allowed her to live in the highest echelons of global society, but the Robinson bloodline did not permit leisure. The inheritance was a burden of compound interest. She viewed herself not as an heiress, but as a general taking command of an army of dollars. The 1860s were a time of legal transition. The Married Women's Property Acts were beginning to take hold, allowing women to manage their own assets, a legal loophole Henrietta would exploit with surgical precision. She had the capital, she had the discipline, and she had the technical knowledge of a seasoned merchant. Wall Street, a bastion of masculine ego and speculative gambling, was about to encounter a woman who possessed a total, terrifying lack of human sentiment. The year 1865 marked the beginning of a legal and financial crusade that would define the witches' methodology, the weaponization of the archive. Upon the death of her aunt, Sylvia Ann Howland, a probate battle erupted that would paralyze the courts of Massachusetts for years. Sylvia had left a fortune of $2.1 million, roughly $130 million in 2026 value, with half designated for charitable causes and the remainder held in a restrictive trust. To Henrietta, the concept of a trust was a personal affront, a mechanism that stripped her of the power of the purse. She countered by producing a previously unknown second will, which contained a codicil claiming that Sylvia had promised to leave the entire estate to Henrietta, provided Sylvia did not change her own will. This was the opening salvo of the Robinson versus Mandel case, a milestone in American forensic history. The technical layer of this battle was not fought with rhetoric, but with the emerging science of document analysis. The estate's trustees, led by Thomas Mandel, hired the most formidable minds of the era, including Dr. Benjamin Pierce, a Harvard mathematics professor and the father of American pragmatism. Pierce applied the law of probability to the signatures on the codicil. He analyzed 30 separate signatures of Sylvia Ann Howland under a microscope, measuring the exact downstrokes and flourishes with a micrometer. Using Bernoulli's theorem, Pierce argued that the probability of two signatures being identical in every stroke was 1 in 2.6 sextillion, a number so vast it practically guaranteed the signatures were traced. The ink itself was scrutinized. 19th century iron gall ink, made from oak galls and ferrous sulfate, had a specific oxidative timeline. The defense argued the ink on the codicil had not aged at a rate consistent with its supposed date. While the legal machinery ground on, the macroeconomic context of the late 1860s provided Henrietta with a secondary, more lucrative front. The United States was reeling from the fiscal trauma of the Civil War. The federal government had issued greenbacks, paper currency not backed by gold, which were trading at a significant discount. Most investors, fearing a total collapse of the Union's credit, avoided them. Henrietta, demonstrating a cold-blooded contrarianism, used her liquid capital to buy these devalued notes in massive quantities. She understood the technicality of the Legal Tender Act of 1862 better than the speculators. She bet that the government would eventually be forced to redeem the notes at par value in gold. When the Specie Payment Resumption Act was later passed, her gamble paid off. Her $6 million inheritance was effectively doubled through the simple, ruthless exploitation of national instability. The courtroom drama ended in a stalemate of sorts. In 1868, the court ruled against her, citing the probability evidence as insurmountable. Yet the loss was a mere technicality. Henrietta had already secured her position as the most liquid individual in America. She left New Bedford for London, fleeing potential charges of forgery and the suffocating social expectations of the Massachusetts elite. In London, she operated from a small, unheated flat, engaging in the technical manipulation of American railroad bonds. She scrutinized the engineering reports of the Erie Railroad and the Union Pacific, looking for hard assets, land grants and steel rails that would survive any market correction. She was no longer just an heiress. She was a predator of debt. She had the capital, and she had discovered that in a world built on credit, the person who holds the cash is the only one who is truly free. But New York was calling, and the price of her return would be the total surrender of her humanity to the ledger. By the mid-1870s, Henrietta, now permanently known as Hetty Green, established her base of operations at the Chemical National Bank at 270 Broadway, New York. The architecture of the building was a testament to Gilded Age excess, featuring high domed ceilings and intricate marble mosaics. Yet Hetty's office was a technical absurdity. She refused to pay for a private suite, which would have cost approximately $300 a year, roughly $9,000 in 2026. Instead, she negotiated a deal with the bank's president, George G. Williams, to occupy a simple wooden desk in the corner of the bank's vault or the main floor. Here, surrounded by the smell of damp ledger paper and the stale metallic scent of gold coin, she managed an empire of mortgages and municipal debt. She was a bank of one, operating with a technical efficiency that surpassed the largest institutions of Wall Street. Her strategy was deep value lending, a process she executed with the precision of a master locksmith. During the Long Depression, 1873-1896, characterized by a 23-year period of erratic growth and frequent panics, liquidity was the rarest commodity. Hetty capitalized on this by becoming the lender of last resort for the very men who mocked her. Her technical specialty was the call loan, money lent on a short-term basis, secured by high-quality collateral and callable at any moment. When the Panic of 1873 hit, triggered by the collapse of J. Cook and Cumberman, the New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days. While the titans of industry, like William Vanderbilt, watched their paper wealth evaporate, Hetty sat at her desk with $20 million in cash. She lent this money at interest rates ranging from 6% to 20%, depending on the desperation of the borrower. In 2026 terms, she was deploying $600 million in liquidity during a period where a common laborer earned less than $1.50 a day. The geography of her empire was meticulously mapped. She focused on the logistics of urban expansion, particularly in Chicago and New York. She bought up foreclosed properties not for their aesthetic value, but for their strategic location near planned transit lines. She analyzed the engineering plans of the New York City subway and the Chicago L train years before they were built. When she foreclosed on a property, she did not sell. She held. By 1880, she owned hundreds of parcels of land in Chicago's Loop and massive swaths of Manhattan real estate. She was the largest individual owner of mortgages in the United States. To manage this, she employed no staff. She personally inspected every property, often traveling in steerage or on freight trains to save the $2 premium of a Pullman sleeper car. $60 today. She kept her records in a series of worn-out satchels, her filing system a chaotic but impenetrable labyrinth of receipts and deeds. The macro-political environment of the 1880s, dominated by the spoils system and rampant corruption in Tammany Hall, worked in her favor. New York City was frequently on the verge of bankruptcy due to mismanagement. When the city needed to fund the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge or the expansion of its water system, it was Hetty Green who bought the municipal bonds. She became a silent partner in the infrastructure of the American dream. However, her public persona was curdling. The press began to fixate on her appearance. Her black mourning clothes, which she wore for decades after her father's death to save on the cost of a new wardrobe, and her habit of carrying a concealed .32 caliber revolver. They dubbed her the Witch of Wall Street, a name she adopted as a protective cloak. As her net worth climbed toward $100 million, over $2.8 billion in 2026, the structure of her personal life began to fracture under the sheer mass of her gold. The ledger was balanced, but the human cost was about to be recorded in the blood of her own family. While the American Gilded Age was defined by the conspicuous consumption described by sociologist Thorstein Veblen, Hetty Green pioneered a philosophy of conspicuous deprivation. The 1890s saw the construction of the gifts of the gods, the massive summer cottages of Newport, Rhode Island. For example, the Breakers, commissioned by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1893, cost $7 million to build, approximately $260 million in 2026. It featured 70 rooms, 300 windows, and used 2,500 tons of limestone. In stark contrast, the wealthiest woman in the world lived in a $5 a week room in Hoboken, New Jersey, or in cheap boarding houses across Brooklyn. In 2026 currency, her rent was roughly $185 per week, a rounding error in her multi-billion-dollar portfolio. Her lifestyle was a technical exercise in resource management, where every calorie and every cent was scrutinized for its return on investment. The logistics of Hetty's daily existence were designed to minimize tax exposure and personal visibility. She adopted the alias Mrs. Dewey to evade the New York City tax assessors, who in 1895 were hunting for personal property tax on the wealthy. This tax, a 2.5% levy on intangible assets like stocks and bonds, would have cost her millions. By technically residing in New Jersey, she exploited the jurisdictional gaps of the era. Her travel was equally calculated. She did not own a carriage, which would have required a coachman, a groom, and the maintenance of a stable. Costs totaling approximately $3,000 a year, $110,000 today. Instead, she used the ferry for 3 cents and walked miles to her properties. She moved her entire physical existence in a series of worn-out trunks and tattered paper bags, containing not jewels, but property deeds and uncashed dividend checks. The technical layer of her frugality extended to her diet and attire. Her morning ritual consisted of cold oatmeal, which she would place in a tin cup and set upon the cast-iron radiators of the Chemical National Bank. These radiators, typically heated by low-pressure steam systems with an output of roughly 200 BTUs per square foot, were her only kitchen. She refused to use hot water at her boarding houses, as she believed it was an unnecessary expense. When her black bombazine dresses became soiled, she instructed the laundress to wash only the bottom hem, where the fabric touched the grime of the New York streets, saving a fraction of a cent on soap. The soap of the era, often a harsh combination of lye and animal tallow, was a commodity she bought in bulk, only when prices dipped during seasonal surpluses. She was a woman who understood the chemistry of preservation and the physics of heat transfer, applied solely to the preservation of her capital. The macroeconomic landscape of the 1890s was one of extreme volatility, including the Panic of 1893, which saw the failure of over 500 banks and 15,000 businesses. While the social register families, the Astors and the Whitneys, continued their $100,000 costume balls, $3.7 million today, Hetty watched the collapse with the eyes of a scavenger. She held the mortgages on the very theaters and churches where the elite displayed their status. She understood that a mortgage on a church was a superior investment to a bond in a railroad. People might stop traveling, but they never stopped praying, especially during a depression. Her luxury was not the comfort of a velvet sofa, but the absolute crushing power she held over those who sat upon them. She was the bruxa, the shadow in the corner of the vault, proving that the greatest wealth is found not in what one spends, but in what one has the discipline to withhold. The world called it madness, but for Hetty, it was the only rational response to a world of predators. She was a billionaire who lived in total poverty by choice, a strategic maneuver that allowed her to remain liquid while the rest of the world was frozen in stone and debt. She had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight, a nomadic predator who could disappear into a Hoboken tenement with $50 million in her pocket. But while she could control her environment and her expenditures, she could not control the human variables within her own home. The world was beginning to notice that her armor of poverty was not just protecting her money, it was suffocating her family. The world called her a witch, but the true horror was not in her appearance, but in the fact that she was willing to sacrifice her children's dignity for the sake of a ledger that never closed. In 1867, the financial world was stunned by the announcement of Henrietta Robinson's marriage to Edward Henry Green. Edward was a man of the world, a Vermont gentleman who had spent 18 years in the Philippines as a partner in Russell and Sturgis, a dominant firm in the Manila hemp and silk trade. He was wealthy in his own right, with a personal fortune of $1 million, $30 million today, and he possessed the social polish that Henrietta lacked. However, the union was not a romantic merger. It was a cold, contractual arrangement. Before the ceremony, Henrietta forced Edward to sign a prenuptial agreement, a legal instrument almost unheard of in the 19th century. This document legally severed their financial identities, ensuring that Edward had no claim to her capital and, crucially, that she had no liability for his debts. The technical engineering of this contract was a masterpiece of mid-Victorian law. Under the coverture laws prevalent in the early 1800s, a woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband upon marriage. Henrietta, however, utilized the Married Women's Property Act of 1848 and its subsequent amendments to create an impenetrable wall around her inheritance. The marriage was a strategic alliance. Edward provided the social beard that allowed her to operate in the male-only enclaves of high finance, while she provided him with the prestige of her massive family name. They lived in London at the Langham Hotel, one of the first grand hotels in the city, featuring hydraulic lifts and electric bells, but they lived in separate suites. Their communication was often conducted via formal notes delivered by hotel staff, a logistical distance that mirrored their emotional void. The macro context of the 1880s brought the structural weakness of their marriage to the fore. Edward was a traditional investor. He believed in the growth of the American West and the stability of the banking system. He became a director of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad and a high-ranking officer at the John J. Cisco and Son Bank. However, the Panic of 1884, triggered by the collapse of the brokerage firm Grant & Ward, sent shock waves through the financial sector. When Cisco and Son failed, it was revealed that Edward had not only lost his own million-dollar fortune, but had also used some of Henrietta's funds, which she had deposited at the bank, to cover his speculative losses. Henrietta's reaction was not one of a betrayed wife, but of a vengeful creditor. She did not offer comfort. She offered an ultimatum. The fallout was a public humiliation that the Gilded Age press devoured. Henrietta moved her accounts to the Chemical National Bank and refused to pay a single cent of Edward's remaining $700,000 debt, $25 million today. She effectively bankrupted her husband to protect her own liquidity. When the bank pressured her, citing the moral obligation of a wife, she famously replied, "My husband is one thing, and my bank account is another." She forced Edward out of their shared life, relegating him to a small room in a club, and eventually he became a remittance man, living on a meager allowance she provided only after he had signed away every possible legal claim to her future earnings. She had successfully foreclosed on her marriage, treating her husband like a defaulted mortgage on a worthless piece of property. With the social mask of Edward Green removed, Henrietta was no longer a wife. She was a sovereign entity. She retreated further into her fortress of solitude, but she was not alone. She had 2 children, Ned and Sylvia, who were now the only heirs to the most complex and gelid fortune in American history. For them, the expulsion of their father was a warning. In their mother's world, there were no relatives, only debtors and creditors. The logistics of their upbringing were now entirely under Henrietta's control, and she would apply the same technical rigor to their lives that she applied to the valuation of railroad bonds. The children were the last remaining assets in her portfolio, and she was determined to ensure they did not depreciate. However, as the 19th century drew to a close, a minor medical emergency would prove that Henrietta's obsession with cost-saving had a price that could not be paid in gold. The year 1907 remains a watershed moment in the history of global finance. A year when the fragile architecture of American banking collapsed under the weight of speculative overextension. The technical trigger was the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, then the 3rd largest trust in New York City. Trust companies were the shadow banks of the era, operating with lower reserve requirements than national banks, a technical loophole that allowed for aggressive, high-risk investments in copper and railroad stocks. When the Knickerbocker's president, Charles T. Barney, was denied a bailout by the New York Clearinghouse, the resulting run on the banks was tectonic. Lines of panicked depositors stretched for blocks along 34th Street, their life savings threatened by the systemic lack of liquidity. At this moment, the United States had no central bank. The Federal Reserve would not be created for another 6 years. The entire economy rested on the private reserves of a few individuals. While J.P. Morgan was sequestered in his library at 225 Madison Avenue, attempting to force the city's bank presidents to create a private rescue fund, Hetty Green sat at her borrowed desk at the Chemical National Bank. Her technical position was impregnable. While the market had gorged on credit, Hetty had hoarded cash. In October 1907, as interest rates for call money on the stock exchange floor soared to an astronomical 70%, Hetty remained the most liquid individual in the world. The city of New York, unable to sell its municipal bonds to an evaporated market, faced immediate default. Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. was forced to approach Hetty Green for a loan to keep the city's infrastructure, its police force, its sanitation, and its schools functioning. The logistics of the meeting were a study in power dynamics. Hetty did not go to City Hall. The city came to her. She agreed to provide a short-term loan of $1.1 million, which in 2026 purchasing power exceeds $38 million. However, she did not accept common municipal bonds as collateral. She demanded short-term revenue bonds backed by the city's future tax receipts, a technical maneuver that ensured she would be the first person paid when the crisis abated. She signed the check with a common steel nib pen, her fingers stained with the cheap black ink she used to cross-reference her own ledgers. The interest she charged was not charitable. It was calculated at the highest legal limit allowed by New York's usury laws. She was the lender of last resort, a title she wore with the same grim satisfaction as her tattered mourning veil. The macroeconomic impact of her intervention was profound. By stabilizing the city's debt, she prevented a secondary collapse of the municipal bond market, which would have triggered a national depression. Yet, her private life remained a theater of the absurd. At the height of the crisis, when she was effectively backstopping the credit of the American metropolis, she was seen in a local grocery store arguing over the price of a bruised cabbage. She lived on a diet of graham crackers and dry oatmeal, items that cost less than 10 cents a day, $3.50 in 2026. She understood the physics of the market, that every action has a reaction and every credit has a corresponding debit, but she refused to apply that logic to her own comfort. To Hetty, spending $1.1 million to save New York was a logical investment. Spending 5 cents on a fresh vegetable was a senseless loss. The 1907 panic also saw the rise of secondary figures like Augustus Heinze, The Copper King, whose failed attempt to corner the United Copper Company market, initiated the crash. Heinze was the antithesis of Hetty, flamboyant, speculative, and driven by ego. While Heinze was ruined, Hetty's wealth increased by an estimated $10 million, $345 million today, during the recovery. She viewed the destruction of men like Heinze with cold detachment. To her, they were not rivals but poorly calibrated machines that had inevitably broken down. However, the world's gratitude was short-lived. The press began to portray her as a vulture, a creature that thrived on the carcasses of the bankrupt. This public vilification deepened her paranoia, leading her to seek protection in the only thing she trusted: iron locks and lead bullets, foreshadowing. She had saved the credit of the greatest city on earth, but she would soon find that no amount of municipal gratitude could purchase a cure for the rot she had allowed to fester within her own home. As the 20th century matured, the legend of the Witch of Wall Street transitioned from a caricature of greed into a case study of clinical paranoia. Hetty's primary residence was no longer a location, but a series of tactical maneuvers. She maintained a nomadic existence, moving between cheap apartments in Hoboken, Jersey City, and Brooklyn, often using the name Mrs. Dewey. The technical reason was the evasion of personal property tax, but the psychological reason was the fear of assassination. She was convinced that the Howland family, still bitter over the probate battle of the 1860s, was conspiring to poison her. She carried a concealed .32 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver in a hidden pocket of her underskirt, a weapon designed for pocket defense with a short barrel and a heavy double-action trigger. The shadow that loomed largest over her legacy was the Howland will case, which resurfaced in legal circles as a masterclass in forensic forgery. The case centered on the second will of Sylvia Ann Howland, which Hetty had presented in 1865. Modern analysis of the signatures reveals a technical anomaly. The signatures on the contested codicil were superposed, meaning they were so identical to the original signature that they could only have been produced by tracing. In an era before carbon paper was perfected, this required the use of a light source and a steady hand. The ink used was a standard iron gall variety, but under microscopic examination, the hesitation marks in the ink flow indicated a lack of the natural fluid motion found in an authentic signature. Hetty had spent her life analyzing the technical details of railroad bonds and currency. It is a dark irony that her greatest legal failure was a failure of technical execution in her own handwriting. The macro context of this period was the rise of the yellow press led by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They found in Hetty Green the perfect villain for a burgeoning populist movement. They reported on her habits with a mixture of disgust and fascination. They detailed her witch outfit, the black bombazine dress that she never laundered, but instead brushed with a stiff bristled broom to remove the street filth. They noted her habit of sleeping with her revolver tied to her wrist with a silk cord. The cost of her safety was a total withdrawal from the sensory world. She refused to eat in restaurants, believing the food was laced with arsenic. She purchased her own eggs and milk, sealing the containers with her personal signet ring to ensure they had not been tampered with. The technical layer of her security extended to her children, Ned and Sylvia. She raised them in an atmosphere of constant fear and deprivation. They were told that the world was composed entirely of fortune hunters and poisoners. This indoctrination had a profound effect on their psychological development. Ned, despite his physical handicap, became her most loyal agent, traveling the country to inspect her properties. Sylvia became a reclusive, terrified shadow of her mother. The wealth they were destined to inherit was presented to them not as a gift, but as a dangerous burden that required constant, gelid vigilance. Hetty's paranoia was not just a personal quirk. It was the operating system of the Green household, a set of protocols designed to ensure that not a single cent was ever diverted from the primary ledger. Curiosities from the National Archives reveal the depth of her meticulousness. Even in her 70s, Hetty would spend hours at the Chemical National Bank's vault, not just counting her money, but physically examining her bonds for signs of tampering. She used a high-powered jeweler's loupe to inspect the engravings on her certificates, checking for the subtle variations that would indicate a counterfeit. She was a woman who lived in the microscopic details of her wealth, yet she was blind to the macroscopic decay of her family. Her refusal to engage with the world had created a vacuum of affection that was being filled by a growing, silent resentment. The witch had built a fortress of gold, but the walls were closing in and the air inside was becoming toxic. Foreshadowing. The paranoia that protected her billions was now a self-fulfilling prophecy. By treating every human interaction as a potential theft, she had ensured that when her health finally failed, she would be surrounded by nothing but the cold, indifferent silence of her own coins. In the winter of 1880, the cold logic of the ledger collided with human biology in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Ned Green, Hetty's 11-year-old son, was riding a sled when he struck a hidden obstacle, resulting in a severe injury to his left knee. From a technical standpoint, the injury likely involved a dislocation of the patella and significant tearing of the cruciate ligaments. In the medical hierarchy of the late 19th century, such an injury required immediate attention from a specialized surgeon to prevent synovial fluid leakage and the subsequent onset of infection. The cost of a private consultation at the time was approximately $10 to $25, roughly $300 to $750 in 2026 currency. To Hetty Green, whose liquid assets already exceeded $10 million, $300 million today, this expenditure was categorized not as a medical necessity, but as a financial inefficiency. Hetty's response was a calculated exercise in class deception. She dressed Ned in the most threadbare rags available and took him to a series of dispensaries, charity clinics designed for the indigent who lived on less than 50 cents a day. These clinics were often staffed by overworked residents and lacked the sterile environments pioneered by Joseph Lister. The technical reality of 1880s charity medicine was grim. Instruments were frequently reused without heat sterilization, and the nursing staff consisted of untrained laborers. When a doctor at one clinic recognized the famous Witch of Wall Street through her disguise, he demanded a standard fee for his services. Hetty's reaction was instantaneous. Rather than pay, she gathered the boy and fled into the winter night. She chose to treat the injury herself using home remedies and cheap poultices, a decision that saved her less than $100 but initiated a 5-year biological countdown. The macroeconomic context of the 1880s reinforced her frugality. The United States was in the midst of a transition from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse, a shift that created massive wealth inequality and a social stigma against the deserving poor. Hetty utilized this stigma as a shield. However, by 1886, the technical condition of Ned's leg had reached a point of systemic failure. Chronic osteomyelitis, a bacterial infection of the bone marrow, had settled in. The leg had become a necrotic mass, leaking pus and threatening a fatal onset of septicemia. In a final, desperate move, Ned was taken to a surgeon in New York. The verdict was absolute. The limb had to be removed. The surgery, an above-the-knee amputation, was performed in a period before reliable antibiotics. The cost of the procedure and the subsequent prosthetic was roughly $1,500 in the currency of the time, or $46,000 in 2026. Ned Green would spend the rest of his life walking on a prosthetic limb. In the 1880s, high-end prosthetics were manufactured by firms like A.A. Marks in New York, which specialized in rubber feet and cork-lined wooden sockets. These devices were technical marvels of the era, utilizing complex spring-loaded joints and leather harness systems to replicate human gait. The cost of maintaining such a device, adjustments for stump shrinkage and the replacement of leather straps, was a recurring expense that Hetty loathed. Ned's disability became a physical manifestation of his mother's wealth. Every step he took, accompanied by the rhythmic thud and creak of cork and spring, reminded the New York elite that Hetty Green valued a $100 bill more than the structural integrity of her own child's skeleton. The boy had survived, but he was now a permanent debtor in his mother's emotional ledger. Foreshadowing. Ned would eventually inherit the billions his leg had been sacrificed for, but he would spend those billions with a vengeful extravagance that would have stopped his mother's heart. By 1910, the Witch of Wall Street was entering her final decade, and the technical decay of her body was becoming impossible to ignore. She suffered from a chronic inguinal hernia, a condition where the abdominal lining protrudes through a weak point in the muscle wall. In the medical landscape of the early 20th century, a hernia was a treatable condition through a surgical procedure known as a hernioplasty. The technical cost for such an operation, including a stay in a private hospital wing with trained nurses, was approximately $150. In 2026, this translates to roughly $4,300. Hetty Green, whose net worth was now approaching the $100 million mark, $2.8 billion today, flatly refused the surgery. She viewed the hospital fee as a predatory tax on her existence. Instead of surgery, Hetty devised a mechanical solution. She utilized a truss, a primitive medical device consisting of a leather belt and a spring-loaded pad designed to provide constant pressure on the hernia to prevent strangulation. However, even the purchase of a high-quality custom-fitted truss was deemed too expensive. Archive records and accounts from her few confidants suggest she used a common block of wood wrapped in rags and held in place by industrial-grade twine and a series of safety pins. This makeshift engineering caused constant discomfort and frequent skin ulcerations, yet Hetty wore it as a badge of fiscal honor. She was a billionaire who functioned through a haze of chronic pain, her movements dictated by the physical limitations of a piece of scrap wood. The macro-political environment of 1913 introduced a new threat to her sanity. The 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which legalized a federal income tax. For a woman whose entire philosophy was built on the absolute retention of capital, the Internal Revenue Service was a demonic entity. The initial tax rate was modest, a 1% tax on incomes over $3,000, with a surtax of up to 6% on incomes over $500,000. But to Hetty, it was institutionalized theft. To evade the tax assessors, she accelerated her nomadic lifestyle. She moved between Hoboken, Jersey City, and the Bronx, staying in unheated boarding houses where the architecture was designed for the working class. Narrow hallways, communal bathrooms, and thin walls. She carried her deeds and stocks in tattered bags, moving in the dead of night to reset her legal domicile. The technical logistics of her movements were a nightmare for her children. Ned and Sylvia were often tasked with transporting heavy trunks filled with paper assets worth millions, while their mother argued with landladies over the price of a candle. The boarding houses of 1914 were often railroad flats where rooms were connected in a linear sequence without hallways, providing no privacy and minimal ventilation. In these cramped quarters, the richest woman on earth sat by the window, utilizing the natural light to read her financial reports to save the cost of a kerosene lamp. Kerosene in 1914 cost about 10 cents a gallon, $2.80 today. To Hetty, this was a luxury she could only justify during a market crash. Her paranoia was no longer just about poison or assassins. It was now focused on the taxman, a specter that haunted every uncashed dividend check in her possession. By 1915, the onset of World War I in Europe had shifted the global economy. Inflation was rising, and the demand for American steel and grain was skyrocketing. Hetty's investments in railroads and real estate were more valuable than ever, yet she was physically collapsing. Her gait was a slow, agonizing shuffle, the wooden block of her truss shifting with every step. Her diet had devolved into a repetitive cycle of raw eggs and cold cereal, as she believed heat was a wasted expense. The woman who could have purchased any mansion on the East Coast was now a prisoner in a series of $5 a week rooms, surrounded by the smell of damp wallpaper and stale oatmeal. She had successfully defended her billions against the state, the market, and her family, but she was losing the war against her own aging biology. The empire was intact, but the empress was a ghost haunting the tenements of New Jersey. The architectural setting for the end of the world's most eccentric fortune was 10 or 32 Fifth Avenue, a neo-French Renaissance mansion owned by Annie Leary, a woman whose life was the polar opposite of Hetty Green's. Leary was a papal countess, a title that cost her millions in charitable donations to the Catholic Church, and her home was a technical marvel of 1916. It featured electric call bells, a private elevator, and an interior temperature controlled by an advanced coal-fired boiler system. On July 3, 1916, this house became the site of a biological and financial fracture. Hetty, at 81, had survived decades of market crashes and the Civil War, but she could not survive the technicality of a milk price discrepancy. In 1916, the American milk industry was undergoing a radical transformation. The transition from raw milk to mandatory pasteurization was being fought in the courts and on the streets of New York. Skimmed milk, which Hetty preferred for its lower cost, was often the subject of milk wars between distributors. A quart of whole milk cost 9 cents, while skimmed milk, essentially the byproduct of the cream separation process, was 5 cents. The debate that triggered Hetty's stroke was focused on this 4-cent difference. To an observer, it was a trivial sum, but in the binary logic of Hetty's mind, it was a 44% markup that violated the fundamental laws of her ledger. The psychological stress of this perceived theft caused a sudden spike in her systolic blood pressure, leading to a rupture in the cerebral arteries. The technical reality of apoplexy in 1916 was a death sentence. Without modern anticoagulants or neurosurgery, the hemorrhage within Hetty's brain caused an immediate loss of motor function and cognitive coherence. As she collapsed onto the marble floor of the Leary kitchen, the sound was not one of a person falling, but of a machine ceasing to function. The staff of the Leary household, accustomed to the silent efficiency of the Gilded Age service, stood paralyzed as the woman who held the mortgages on half of Manhattan died in a dress that was literally falling apart. The black bombazine fabric, made from a mixture of silk and wool, had a tensile strength that had been compromised by decades of wear and improper storage. It tore as the maid tried to lift her, revealing the newspapers she used for insulation. The macroeconomic context of July 1916 was one of wartime tension. The United States was months away from entering World War I, and the federal government was searching for ways to fund the massive expansion of the Navy and Army. The Revenue Act of 1916, signed into law just after Hetty's death, introduced a new estate tax with a top rate of 10% on estates over $5 million. Hetty's death was timed with accidental perfection for the taxman. Had she lived a few months longer, the complexity of her liquid holdings might have allowed her to sequester funds in new ways. Instead, her death opened a vault containing $100 million in cash, bonds, and real estate, equivalent to over $2.95 billion in 2026. The liquidity she had hoarded to protect herself from the world was now a sitting target for a government preparing for global conflict. Curiosities from the medical archive of the time show that Hetty's body was a map of her own self-inflicted poverty. Beyond the stroke, she suffered from the long-term effects of her untreated hernia, which had caused significant tissue damage. Her skin showed signs of chronic vitamin deficiency, a result of her refusal to pay for fresh produce. Even in her final moments, she was a technical anomaly, a human being who had successfully converted her biological health into financial capital. As the news of her death reached Wall Street, the ticker tapes did not stop, but the price of New York City municipal bonds fluctuated. The witch was gone, and for the first time in 80 years, the most aggressive lender in America was no longer at her desk. The fall in 1916 was the final, inevitable audit of a woman who had spent 80 years refusing to pay the cost of being alive. The distribution of the green fortune was a technical dismantling of a century of austerity. Under the terms of the will, the estate was split between Ned and Sylvia, but the true winner was the Internal Revenue Service. The probate process lasted for years, as tax assessors meticulously combed through Hetty's thousands of uncashed checks and property deeds hidden in obscure Hoboken closets. Ultimately, the family paid roughly $14 million in state and federal taxes, equivalent to $420 million today. It was the largest inheritance tax payment in American history up to that point, a final irony for a woman who spent her life moving between boarding houses to save a few dollars in local levies. Ned Green's response to his inheritance was a vengeful, high-tech extravagance. He immediately shed the rags of his childhood and became a pioneer of the new age of technology. He moved to an estate in Round Hill, Massachusetts, where he built a private radio station, WMAF, and invested heavily in the emerging field of aeronautics. His technical obsession was the polar opposite of his mother's. He purchased a fleet of cars, including several custom-built Stearns Knight models with sleeve valve engines, which cost $5,000 each in 1920, $85,000 today. He bought a 250-foot yacht, the Lindonia II, which required a crew of 40 and cost $30,000 a month to operate, $510,000 in 2026. Ned was not just spending money. He was incinerating the philosophy of his mother's life with the precision of a thermal lance. The macro context of the 1920s facilitated this squandering. The Roaring Twenties was an era of unprecedented speculative bubbles and consumerism. While Hetty had built her wealth through deep value and the hoarding of cash, Ned participated in the culture of the big spend. He became a world-renowned philatelist and numismatist, buying rare coins and stamps at record prices. He famously purchased the inverted Jenny sheet of stamps for $20,000 in 1918, $430,000 today. By the time of his death in 1936, Ned had successfully liquidated a significant portion of his mother's hard-earned capital. He died in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, surrounded by luxury but lacking the strategic foresight that had built the empire. He was the biological endpoint of the Green dynasty, a man who spent his life compensating for a missing leg with the weight of his mother's gold. Sylvia, by contrast, remained a reclusive shadow. She married Matthew Astor Wilkes, a descendant of John Jacob Astor, but the union was childless. Sylvia's life was defined by a paralyzing fear of the world her mother had described as a den of poisoners and fortune hunters. When she died in 1951, her estate was worth $90 million, $1.1 billion today. Having no heirs, she left the vast majority of it to 64 different charities, churches, and hospitals. The technical dissolution was complete. The money that Hetty Green had spent 80 years defending with a revolver and a block of wood was scattered across the very institutions she had despised for their wastefulness. The churches she had foreclosed upon were now the beneficiaries of her long-term greed. Today, the physical ruins of the Green Empire are virtually non-existent. The Round Hill estate was largely demolished or repurposed for research by MIT. The boarding houses in Hoboken have been gentrified or torn down. The Witch of Wall Street has no monument, no university named after her, and no philanthropic foundation that bears her name. Her legacy is found only in the dusty archives of the New York probate courts and in the cautionary tales of financial history. She was a woman who mastered the technicality of the dollar but failed the test of the human spirit. The gold has been recycled, the bonds have expired, and the land has been sold a dozen times over. In the end, the ledger was indeed balanced, and the final entry was zero. Hetty Green spent her entire life proving that it was possible to own the world without ever belonging to it. In the end, she was not the owner of the fortune, but its most loyal and miserable slave.